Mastering electronic dance music.
Hey, welcome to Mastering EDM with Logic Pro, and this is the third video in the series introducing mixing. And today we're going to be covering EQ. What I have here is I have a project that I made, and it's got three synthesizers with the ES2, and they're labeled high, mid, and low. And I'm going to bring up an EQ in a second here, and you'll see that I'll talk about highs, mids, and lows. But it's not the same thing as these synthesizers. I'm going to show you what I mean, and this is a high note. Okay, here's the mid. And if you could hear this, this is the lows. It's really deep bass. I don't know if you could hear that. It takes some pretty big speakers to get in that, or good headphones. So anyway, you have highs, mids, and lows. And now I'm going to pull up an EQ here. You could do this by going to EQ and choosing channel EQ or linear phase EQ. I'm not going to talk about the differences because they're not that important right now. Or this is what I do. It's typically faster. You just double click EQ. It adds an EQ to the first open slot, and then it pulls up the EQ here. So what I have here is I have highs, which is about this area, and mids, which is about this area, and lows, which is this area. Whoops, I already did something here, so let's recall default. And now there are three types of EQ curves you could have. The first one is this curve, which is like a bump, and you can make it look like a peak too. And the second one is the shelf, which you could have on either side, and it could go up or down. And I'm going to turn those off really quick. And then you have the cuts. They're also called the passes. So in this case, the low one is called the low cut or the high pass. Why? Because it either cuts the lows or it lets the highs pass. And so it has two names there. Same with this one. It's either a high cut or a low pass. You kind of need to know both because people talk using both terms. I prefer the cut terms because they make more sense to me, because that's what it's actually doing. It's not so much letting it's not so much letting frequencies pass. What it's actually doing is it's actually cutting frequencies. So I prefer to use cut. So the low cut and the low pass, high cut, high pass, that's a more difficult one. The shelves are easier to remember because it's always a shelf. And whether it goes up or down, this is always the low shelf, and whether it goes up or down, this is always the high shelf. So that kind of gets you, makes you think, okay, so if this is the high shelf and this is the high cut, then that's the highs. If this is the low shelf and this is the low cut, that's the lows. It's a good way of thinking about it. And then everything in the middle is the mids. So I've been showing you these, and that's so much more so the tool of EQ, but what is actually EQ really doing? And I'll show you right here. Essentially, I talked about in my previous video that you have volume as a major component of these new plugins that we're going to start talking about. And this is one of the such things. This is talking about volume, which is this, in respect to frequency, which is this, from lows to highs. Now, the way this sounds, if you have not heard an EQ, is dependent on what type of curve you're using. I'll show you here. I'll let this loop and I'll talk over it. So I have the synthesizer, and I can cut the lows. And it kind of shows you what it's really doing. You have these highs. Is basically everything up there. And then you get more body as you pull it back down. Now, similar thing, if I do this, I'm cutting out all the brightness and leaving only the body. So you see what EQ is pretty much doing there. Now, those you don't use too much. Well, you use the low cut a lot because you got to get rid of bass, because bass tends to build up quite a bit. But I'll talk about that later when I talk about getting more into the mix downs and putting everything together. So, but right now what we have is we have these in the middle. Now, what are these used for? Now, I'll show you what it sounds like. I'll just do a little sweep. So what you hear is this. It sounds like it's boosting only in certain areas, and that's what it is. It's taking whatever frequency you have, and it's pulling up by the volume level under the curve. So for instance, right here, it's boosting it by this much. Right here, it's boosting it by this much. Similar with cuts. Cuts are a little bit harder to listen to because when you're taking away something, it's harder for you to realize what's being taken away unless you're moving it. So let me. So it doesn't sound nearly as obvious as this one. So, but what do we really use these for? This is used for mixing and also for stylistic reasons. So, in respect to mixing, this is where these three instruments that I talked about, where EQ comes in, and it's kind of like these. I have this high synth right here, which is pretty high. Now, if I think about it in terms of EQ, add an EQ here, and I show the analyzer, you'll notice that it's got some stuff in the bass, but most of it is up here at the top end. It's mostly highs. It's a high synth. Make sense? It's not always truth though. I'll show you that in a second, but for now, I'll show you working with this. So we don't need any lows on this. So if you notice, that didn't change the sound at all. I just cut out all that stuff right there, and it didn't change the sound. That kind of frees up some space in the term of the mix. Now, by itself, that didn't sound like it did anything, but if you have like 50 instruments, and they're all running with some lows, it all just builds up. And it's the idea of, when you have like a sink, and if you clean the sink really well, it looks all nice, and you use the sink, and it doesn't look like it leaves any residue behind. Okay, so you'll never have to clean it again, right? Wrong. Eventually what happens is the water buildup leaves residue, and it's the same thing with this. When you have this really small amount of bass coming from each of these tracks, even if it's a really small amount, it builds up because in EDM, you do not have like 16 tracks. 16 tracks is like your drums and your bass line, and that's about it. So the idea is you need to free up some of the space in the low end. Now, why wouldn't you free up space in the high end? You do a little bit, but not as much, because the way the volume in the low end and the high end works. I'll not go into too much detail, but suffice it to say that low end is kind of like it's big and chunky. If you think about it, it's kind of like it feels heavy, and so a little bit of heaviness is bigger in size than a little bit of brightness, because brightness is a lot smaller, let's say. So you need more room for bass than you need room for highs. Now that said, one of the things that you'll do, first let me talk about why it's not always the case by way of EQ and what you see. So let me turn that one off just cause. And here. So we have this mid one. Let me turn off the highs, and the analyzer's off, but where do you think it would be? Okay, mid, so let's guess it'd be right here. That's not entirely the truth. We have quite a bit in the low end, much more than the other one, and we have some still in the high end. So why is that if it's mids? Well, it's because the harmonics created produce high frequency sound. And harmonics, they're basically like, you take a sound like this, which is just like a sine wave, which is really low, and you stack those to create a different sound, which is like this. Sounds like a really complex process, and it is. That's what synthesis is. It takes sine waves and it kind of layers them on top of each other to create different sounds. That's how your speakers work. So everything that you hear is basically composed of sine waves, which are these really dull sounds that are basically like this. Whoops. If I pull this up to a higher frequency too, you could hear. Everything you hear is composed of a whole bunch of those. And, whoops. So, there we go. Now, the reason I said that is because you have... This one is focused on mids, but does that mean you should cut out the mids and the lows just to give the mids? Well, not really, because that doesn't sound good. It sounds better like this, doesn't it? And if I let the low end go through, it sounds a little better too. So it's not always, the sound of the instrument is not always directly correlated to what EQ you use. And that is relevant because people ask all the time, I have this instrument, how do I EQ it? And I've heard this a lot because I've been on a lot of forums in regards to audio, and I've listened to quite a few like podcasts and stuff like that where people ask this all the time. Where do I EQ this? I have a bass, where do I EQ it? Now, people can generally answer your question, but the truth is, each of these instruments, be it real or virtual, create different harmonics. And microphones, if you're recording, pick up these sounds differently also. So what happens is you end up with an imbalance that you need to fix. And even more so, once that balance is made, you can boost what you think is important to that instrument to give it more prominence. So in the example of the high synth here, what can I do to give it a little more prominence? Because it's basically balanced. So it sounds like it's supposed to be bright, but it's kind of plain. So let me pull up this right where it sounds, makes it sound bright. That gives it brightness. Now if I turn this off, listen what happens. Sounds like dead, doesn't it? So by pulling that up, what I did is instead of just balancing it, I accentuated it. I made it so it stood out a little bit more. And I'm going to pull this down here because I also know that this doesn't sound very good if you listen. That gives it a lot of almost a whistling noise that I don't want so much. Because this is actually not supposed to be my main instrument. This is my main instrument. This is just supposed to flavor it. So if I turn this off, it sounds a little bit sharper when I have the EQ on now. And that was the goal of the high instrument. So now I have the mids. How can I make the mids sound better? Well, that gives it a lot of body, but it also kind of sounds muddy. So how do I fix that? Well, let's use a thinner one and sweep to find around where we want. Now I could boost at the top again to make it brighter, but I don't really want to do that with this synth because I already have brightness coming from somewhere else. Hey, that sounds good. That sounds nice. It gives it a little more low end. It makes it kind of a bit more powerful. So now I'm going to boost somewhere in the high mids to give it so it has not just more body, but it also stands out a little bit more and cuts through the mix a little better. Now, one of the things about mixing and EQ is you'll be always tempted to use the high shelf to give it more brightness because, oh, that sounds so much better, doesn't it? Now, if I turn that off, you're like, oh, now it sounds dead again. Put it back on. No, I'm not going to. And the reason why is because you end up with something. I talked about bass. You need space for bass because bass builds up. This is kind of different, though, because what happens when you have too much high end is it tends to either phase, which I'll show you what phasing is in a second. I could actually do that relatively easy here. But the other thing it tends to do is when you have your final track, it tends to make it sound, instead of sounding sharp at the high end, it sounds kind of like someone applied some sort of garble to it. Here, I'll show you what it sounds like. If I do this, I have nice and bright. Sounds nice and bright. Now I'm going to apply some sort of modulation, because modulations do a terrible job at keeping those. So now it doesn't really sound sharp, it kind of sounds... See, that's sharp, and now it just kind of sounds like someone's playing the music behind, like they put a towel over the speaker or something. So that's one of the reasons you don't have too much, because what happens is when you do your final bounce of the track, it ends up sounding right, but if you upload it to something like SoundCloud, what they'll do is they'll do something called downsampling, and actually no, they'll encode it. There we go. That's what I was looking for. They'll encode it, and when they do that, they cut down the size of the file to make it easier for people to stream. And that's all fine and dandy, but it causes any high-end stuff to be garbled. Now, I'm going to show you what phasing is. This is the other thing I was talking about. If I add gain, this is the easiest way to phase. So I stick it to mono, and you could already hear phasing. So it sounds bright. If you hear that sort of phaser sound, then if you pay attention to that, you kind of hear where it's phasing. Now I'll really show you what phasing does. Now I'm going to invert the phase of one of the sides, and everything that's the same between the two will be canceled, and this is what it sounds like. So it sounds really cool as an effect, but if you listen to it, it doesn't sound good musically for your main instrument. So that's why you want to be careful about high end. It's really easy to want to add high end, but instead of adding high end, try to add high mids, which is about here. So instead of going all the way up past 5K and boosting there like that, try to find around here what would sound best. And then if I add this one, the high one, it gives it the highs that it needs, but if you'll notice, this one, we only actually did a slight boost here. We didn't do a whole like shelf and pull it up all the way. So it adds that bite. And I do some cuts here, but here we go, I want this one. There we go. So you see, basically what I did is I took out what was making it sound wrong and added what was making it sound right. That's the idea of mixing. Low end is a lot harder to mix. I'll tell you that right now, because the way low end is it's a lot less forgiving when you get something wrong. So like I said, it's like you're working with bigger chunks of sound. So I could EQ this, but I really don't need to, because it's since it's a sine wave that I'm using, it's pretty elementary in its structure. And if I go to make the resolution higher, that didn't help much. But if you see, there's this one peak that's kind of moving up and down, and pretty much there's just otherwise this downward slope. There's nothing like crazy going on like there was before. So that's the idea of the sine wave. It's pretty simple. And if I boost right here, that helps, but it's essentially the same as if I would have been pulling up the volume. So there's no point in really EQing this that much. That's one of the reasons it's also so hard to work with, because you don't have a lot of room for what you're EQing. Now when you get to, when you actually have a bass line that's not just a sub like this, then you can have more flexibility, but it is still hard to work with. So keep that in mind. So pretty much, like I was saying, you have these EQs, which lets you boost anywhere here throughout the frequency spectrum of whatever you have it on. and it can be used to accentuate or remove what you don't want, and at the same time, you have these instruments which may be labeled high, mid, and low, but that doesn't always mean that you boost the highs, boost the mids, and boost the lows for them. And it doesn't always mean that this is only comprised of highs, this is only comprised of mids, and this is only comprised of lows, because you could easily have a bass line with a lot of highs. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that the instruments don't always have particular EQ settings that you always need to tweak. Now, if you use the same synthesizer 50 times in 50 different tracks, yes, you could probably use the same EQ on every single one. Granted, you would probably actually tweak it from track to track, but that's the component of mixing your tracks and making them sound cohesive and still keeping that artistic, refined style inside of them. So, those are the couple of things you need to keep in mind. Remember, if you want to figure out how to EQ an instrument, you could get general guidelines, and you could ask, okay, I have a guitar, how do I EQ it? And people will say, probably cut the mids around here, boost the highs around here, or cut or boost the lows somewhere around here, something like that. But they can't ever give you a definitive answer like at 770 hertz, you need to boost by 2.3 dB at a curve of 57. And no one's going to tell you that. That's what you need to listen to and figure out on your own. That's the hard part about mixing. So volume was all about getting that depth, and EQ is a similar thing of that. It's making your tracks so that they kind of slot into their appropriate spot. So if you think about it this way, volume is the placement between the front and the back. If I pull up this multimeter here again, volume is the placement from here to here, and EQ is getting it so that your tracks are not stepping on each other as they're placed here. So they each have their own unique spot, and they kind of fit together like a puzzle piece. That said, if you... just because you have a low instrument, no, actually the mid's better. Just because you have a mid instrument doesn't mean that you get rid of all the mids on the high and all the mids on the bass line. It's all about finding the right balance for the right instrument. It's rather difficult, but it's worth the time. So that's it for this video. The next video is going to be on compression. And compression is pretty much like dynamic volume. It's volume that changes depending on what you're feeding it. So that'll be an interesting topic, and I'll try to get that one up pretty quickly here. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe and comment and like this video. That helps me feel motivated to get this stuff going and keep it running and post as often as I can. But in the meantime, stay posted, and I'll get you another video as soon as I can. Bye.